She hadn't planned to fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder. Finley Howard, the woman Forbes called the Ice Queen of Fashion, had built an empire on control and precision. But when the plane landed and she woke up, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, crying. Not from the humiliation of falling asleep on a stranger, but from what that quiet single dad beside her had done while she slept. Think you can guess what happens next? Leave your prediction in the comments and hit subscribe to see if you're right. It was 5:30 a.m. at Los Angeles International Airport. The kind of pre-dawn hour when the terminal lights shimmered across polished floors like cold stars, and the city outside still slept beneath a blanket of darkness. Flight 1847 was boarding for New York's JFK. And in seat 14B sat Finley Howard, the 35-year-old CEO of Lumiere, a global luxury fashion conglomerate that had gone from near bankruptcy to industry dominance in just 7 years. Her assistant had booked her this last-minute red-eye after a brutal week of crisis management meetings, emergency board sessions, and a contentious press conference where she'd faced down hostile shareholders with ice in her veins. She was exhausted. The kind of exhausted that no amount of espresso could touch. The kind that settled into your bones and made even breathing feel like work. Despite the expertly applied makeup, her pale complexion showed the toll of sleepless nights, and there were shadows beneath her sharp green eyes that no concealer could fully mask. She was dressed in her signature tailored blue suit, impeccably cut, not a thread out of place, with her dark hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her phone never left her hand. Emails, acquisition reports, stock projections, crisis memos. Her entire existence lived behind that glowing screen. To Finley, time was currency and small talk was bankruptcy. She'd built her empire on ruthless efficiency and emotional distance. Success had cost her everything human: 2 broken engagements with men who'd called her incapable of love, estrangement from a family who claimed she'd become too important for them, and friendships that had withered from years of neglect and canceled plans. She took her seat with her usual armor intact: noise-canceling headphones, designer carry-on position precisely in the overhead bin, and a deliberately cold expression meant to discourage conversation from whoever sat beside her. She didn't even glance at the man settling into 14A, the one in worn jeans and a plain white t-shirt, with hands that bore the calluses of hard work. Or the small boy clutching a toy airplane, his eyes bright with excitement about his first time flying. In her world, people like them were invisible. Background noise. Ordinary. But in a few short hours, that man would do something so simple, so unexpectedly kind, that it would shatter everything Finley Howard thought she knew about power, success, and what it really meant to be human. Finley woke to the gentle pressure of turbulence and the muted hum of the aircraft engines. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Then awareness crashed over her like ice water. Her head was resting on something warm. Something that definitely wasn't her window. She jerked upright, blinking rapidly, her heart hammering with a mixture of confusion and rising horror. The man beside her, the one she hadn't bothered to acknowledge, was looking at her with an expression of gentle amusement. Not mockery. Not judgment. Just kindness. "I'm so sorry," Finley stammered, her voice rough from sleep. She pressed her fingers to her temples, mortification flooding through her. "I didn't mean to, I never." Her usual poise had abandoned her completely. The woman who commanded boardrooms full of hostile executives, who'd stared down aggressive investors without flinching, couldn't finish a simple sentence. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. "It's okay," the man said softly, his voice carrying a warmth she hadn't expected. "You looked like you needed the rest." There was no sarcasm in his tone. No subtle dig. Just simple, genuine understanding. It threw her completely off balance. Finley instinctively reached for her phone, her lifeline, her security blanket, her escape from uncomfortable moments. She'd left it on her tray table before exhaustion claimed her, and she remembered it had been at 2% battery, flashing the dreaded red warning. She'd been too tired to care, figuring she'd deal with a dead phone when she landed. But when she picked it up, the screen showed 100%. She stared at it, confused. Then she noticed the portable power bank sitting beside it on her tray table. Definitely not hers. She looked at the man, her eyebrows drawing together. She started, then stopped. "Did you?" He nodded, a small, almost shy smile crossing his face. "Yeah. I noticed your phone was about to die, and you were sleeping so soundly, I didn't want to wake you." Figured you probably had important things to do when you woke up. Didn't want you waking up to a dead phone and adding stress to your morning. For a long moment, Finley simply stared at him, unable to form words. In her world, the world of corporate warfare and cutthroat competition, people didn't do things like this. They didn't give without expecting something in return. Every gesture came with strings attached. Every kindness was a transaction, a networking opportunity, a calculated move in an endless game of chess. But this man, this stranger whose name she didn't even know, had done something for her while she was vulnerable and unaware. Something small. Something that cost him nothing but a moment of attention and care. And he expected nothing in return. It unsettled her more than any hostile takeover attempt ever had. "Thank you," she finally managed, and the words felt strange in her mouth. How long had it been since she'd thanked someone and actually meant it? That was incredibly thoughtful. "Mark," he said, extending his hand. "Mark Stephen." "Finley," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. The hands of someone who worked with them, who built things, who created with more than just words and contracts. Finley Howard. If her name meant anything to him, he didn't show it. No recognition flickered in his dark eyes. No shift in demeanor. To him, she wasn't the Ice Queen or the CEO who turned Lumiere into a powerhouse. She was just Finley, a woman who'd fallen asleep on his shoulder. It was the most anonymous she'd felt in years. And strangely, it felt like relief. "Is this your first time flying?" Mark asked, gesturing toward the small boy curled up beside him, still sleeping peacefully. "No," Finley said, glancing at the child. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, his small hand clutching a toy airplane even in sleep. "I fly constantly. Too much, probably." "This is Noah's first time," Mark said, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "He's been talking about it for weeks. Couldn't sleep last night, he was so excited." Something in Finley's chest tightened at the tender way Mark looked at his son. She couldn't remember her own parents ever looking at her like that, with such uncomplicated love, such genuine pride in simply being near her. As if on cue, Noah stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He sat up, looked around with wide-eyed wonder, then immediately pressed his face to the window. "Dad. Dad, look. We're in the clouds." His voice was bright with excitement, completely uninhibited. "Are we really flying? Like, actually flying?" "We really are, buddy," Mark said, his smile transforming his entire face. "How high are we? Why don't we fall? Do the wings move? Can birds fly this high? What if?" The questions tumbled out in an endless stream, each one delivered with breathless enthusiasm. Finley braced herself for the inevitable impatience, the moment when the parent would snap, tell the child to be quiet, to stop asking so many questions. But Mark didn't. Instead, he answered each question with the same gentle patience, the same genuine interest, as if his son's curiosity was the most important thing in the world. He explained lift and thrust in simple terms. He talked about air pressure and altitude. When Noah asked if they could see their house from up here, Mark didn't dismiss the question. He helped him try to spot familiar landmarks through the clouds. Finley watched them, something unfamiliar twisting in her chest. She couldn't name the emotion. Envy? Longing? Grief for something she'd never had? In her childhood, questions were interruptions. Curiosity was inconvenient. Her parents had been busy, important people with no time for a daughter who wanted to know why the sky changed colors or how rainbows formed. She'd learned early to be quiet, to be perfect, to take up as little space as possible. She'd thought she'd turned out just fine. But watching Mark with Noah, the way he leaned in close, the way he listened like his son's words held secrets to the universe, the way he made space for wonder in the middle of an ordinary morning, Finley realized what she'd missed. What she'd never even known to miss. Miss. Noah's voice broke through her thoughts. "Do you fly a lot?" She turned to find the boy looking at her with those same warm, curious eyes as his father. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out softer than intended. "I do. Is it still exciting? Or does it get boring?" An honest question. When had someone last asked her an honest question? "It got boring a long time ago," she admitted. Then, surprising herself, she added, "But watching your face right now? That makes it exciting again." Noah beamed at her, then turned back to the window, and Finley caught Mark's eye. He was looking at her with something she couldn't quite read. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition, as if he saw something in her that she'd thought she'd hidden too well for anyone to find. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Finley Howard didn't look away. The seatbelt light blinked off with a soft chime, and the cabin settled into that peculiar mid-flight stillness, the hum of engines, the rustle of newspapers, the murmur of quiet conversations. Noah had returned to his window, tracing the shapes of clouds with his finger against the glass, lost in his own world of wonder. Finley found herself in unfamiliar territory. She didn't want to retreat behind her phone. For the first time in years, the endless stream of emails and notifications felt less urgent than the man sitting beside her. So, she began, then hesitated. Small talk had always felt like currency she didn't want to spend. But this felt different. What takes you to New York? Mark's expression shifted, still warm, but touched with something more serious. Job interview, he said. It's with a construction management firm in Brooklyn. Decent salary, benefits, stable hours. He paused, his fingers absently straightening Noah's collar. The kind of opportunity we've been waiting for. There was weight behind those words. The kind that spoke of long nights and difficult choices. What do you do now? Finley asked, and realized she genuinely wanted to know. Not for networking purposes. Not to assess his worth. Just to know. Right now? 2 jobs. Mark's smile was rueful but not bitter. I work overnight security at a warehouse, then day shifts doing residential repairs, plumbing, electrical work, whatever needs fixing. It keeps food on the table and a roof over our heads, but... He glanced at Noah, his voice dropping lower. It's not sustainable. I barely see him some weeks. He deserves better than a father who's always exhausted. Finley absorbed this quietly. She tried to imagine working 2 jobs, tried to picture the bone-deep exhaustion of that kind of life. But her tiredness came from first-class flights and luxury hotels, from too many business dinners and never enough sleep in 1,000 thread-count sheets. It wasn't the same. Not even close. It must be difficult, she said, and the words felt inadequate. It is, Mark admitted. But it's temporary. That's what I keep telling myself. This interview, it could change everything. Normal hours. 1 steady job. Time to actually be present for Noah. His face softened. Time to keep the promises I made. Something in his tone made Finley pause. Promises. Mark was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of memory. My wife, Elena. She died 2 years ago. Cancer. He said it simply, without dramatics, but Finley could hear the grief beneath the words, not raw anymore but permanent. A scar that would never fully fade. Before she passed, she made me promise 2 things, that I'd never let Noah forget how much she loved him, and that I'd never stop believing there were good things ahead. Even when it got hard. Finley's breath caught. She didn't know what to say. In her world, people didn't speak about loss like this, openly, honestly, without trying to spin it into something palatable or productive. Grief was private. Vulnerability was weakness. But Mark wasn't being weak. There was a quiet strength in the way he spoke about his late wife, a dignity in his honesty that made Finley's carefully constructed walls feel suddenly fragile. I'm sorry, she managed. That must have been. I can't imagine. Thank you. Mark's smile was sad but genuine. Some days are harder than others. But Noah keeps me going. He's got his mother's heart, curious about everything, sees the good in people, believes the world is full of possibilities. He chuckled softly. He wants to be a pilot. Has since he was 4. Sees a plane in the sky and his whole face lights up. That's why I saved for months to get us real tickets instead of taking the bus to New York. Wanted him to have this. Wanted him to feel like his dreams were real, not just kid stuff I'd eventually tell him to give up on. Finley felt something crack inside her chest. When was the last time someone had sacrificed for her dreams? When was the last time she'd sacrificed for anyone else's? She thought of her own childhood, the expensive boarding schools, the designer clothes, the material abundance that somehow never filled the emotional void. Her parents had given her everything except presence. Everything except the kind of love that showed up, that listened, that believed in dreams about flying. "That's beautiful," she said quietly, and meant it. Mark shrugged, almost embarrassed. "Just trying to be the dad he deserves. Some days I feel like I'm failing, working too much, too tired to play, barely keeping it together. But then he looks at me like I hung the moon, and I think maybe I'm getting a few things right." "You're getting more than a few things right," Finley said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. He met her eyes, and something passed between them, understanding maybe. Recognition. "What about you?" he asked. "What takes you to New York?" Finley opened her mouth to give her standard answer: business meetings, corporate obligations, the endless demands of running a global company. But the words felt hollow before she could even speak them. "Work," she said instead, simply. "It's always work." "What do you do?" "I run a fashion company." She deliberately didn't name it, didn't quantify its size or success. For once, she wanted to be seen as just a person, not a title. "Do you love it?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. Did she love it? She'd never asked herself that. Success had been the goal. Power. Validation. Proving everyone wrong who said she'd never make it. But love? "I'm good at it," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked." His tone wasn't challenging, just curious. Genuinely curious about her answer. When was the last time someone had been curious about what she felt, not what she'd accomplished? Finley looked down at her hands, manicured, decorated with tasteful jewelry, hands that had signed $100 million deals but hadn't held another person's in years. "No," she admitted, so quietly she barely heard herself. "I don't think I do." Mark didn't respond right away. He just nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. As if admitting that she'd built her entire life around something she didn't love wasn't a devastating confession. "It's never too late," he said finally. "To find what you love. To start over. Elena taught me that. She was a teacher, loved every second of it, even when it was hard. She used to say that life was too short to spend it doing things that made you feel empty inside." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I try to remember that. Even on the hard days." Finley felt her throat tighten. This man, this stranger who worked 2 jobs and raised his son alone and saved for months to buy plane tickets, was speaking about hope and love and finding meaning. While she, with all her wealth and power and success, felt empty. Had felt empty for so long she'd forgotten what fullness might feel like. Mark wasn't complaining. He wasn't asking for pity or help. He was just talking. Sharing his life with the same openness he'd shown his son. And Finley realized with startling clarity that she couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like this, without an agenda, without wanting something, without measuring their words for maximum advantage. He was just being human. And it was dismantling her. "Your wife sounds like she was remarkable," Finley said. "She was," Mark agreed. Then he looked at Noah, still captivated by the clouds, and his expression softened further. Still is, in him. In the way he loves people. The way he believes good things are possible. Finley followed his gaze to the boy, and something in her chest shifted, something she didn't have a name for. Something that felt dangerously close to longing. And for the first time in her carefully controlled life, Finley Howard felt truly vulnerable. She didn't like it. But she also couldn't look away. The breakfast service cart rattled down the aisle, its metallic clink breaking through the low hum of conversation. A flight attendant with a practiced smile stopped at their row, leaning in with the rehearsed cheerfulness of someone who'd asked the same question 1,000 times. "Breakfast this morning? We have a vegetable omelette or a croissant sandwich." Finley waved her hand dismissively. "No thank you. I never eat airplane food." The words came out automatically, the same response she'd given on hundreds of flights. Truth was, she'd trained herself years ago to view meal times as wasted productivity. Food was fuel, nothing more, and airplane food was beneath her standards. The attendant nodded and turned to Mark. "And for you, sir?" Mark glanced at the small menu card, and Finley caught the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the look of someone doing mental math, calculating costs against necessity. "Just a juice box for my son, please," he said with an easy smile. "Apple, if you have it." "Nothing for yourself." "I'm good, thank you." The attendant moved on, and Mark gently adjusted Noah's blanket, tucking it around the boy's shoulders with the careful attention of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. The juice box sat on his tray table, waiting for when Noah woke. Finley pretended to scroll through her emails, but she was acutely aware of the man beside her. She'd heard it, the low, barely audible rumble of his stomach. Saw the way his hand briefly pressed against his abdomen, a gesture so quick she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching. He was hungry. He'd worked 2 jobs, scraped together money for plane tickets, and now he was buying a juice box for his son while his own stomach complained. And he did it without hesitation, without complaint, as if this was simply how things were. As if his own needs came second, or not at all. Something twisted uncomfortably in Finley's chest. She thought about the time she dropped $200 on a lunch she'd barely touched, the catered boardroom spread she'd walked past without a second glance, the hotel minibars she'd ignored because the snacks weren't organic enough or interesting enough or whatever arbitrary standard she'd imposed that day. "Excuse me," Mark said softly, unclipping his seatbelt. "Just need to use the restroom. If Noah wakes up." "I'll keep an eye on him," Finley said, surprising herself. Mark smiled gratefully and slipped past her into the aisle. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Finley pressed the call button above her seat. The same flight attendant appeared within moments. "Yes, ma'am? Changed your mind about breakfast?" "No," Finley said quietly, her voice low enough that Noah wouldn't hear if he woke. She reached for her wallet, extracting her credit card with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to making things happen quickly. "The man in 14A, I'd like to purchase the hot breakfast sandwich for him, and upgrade his son's juice to the full kid snack pack. Whatever that includes." The attendant's eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course. That's very kind. But I need you to do me a favor," Finley interrupted, her tone taking on the executive edge she usually reserved for negotiations. "When you bring it, tell him there was a mistake with the order. Tell him the meal was already paid for and would go to waste if he didn't take it. Don't mention me. Can you do that?" Understanding dawned on the attendant's face, softening into something warm. "Absolutely. Give me just a few minutes." Finley handed over her card, completed the transaction with practiced speed, and by the time Mark returned, she was staring intently at her phone, scrolling through emails she wasn't actually reading. Mark settled back into his seat, and Finley kept her eyes fixed on her screen, hyper-aware of every movement beside her. 3 minutes later, the flight attendant reappeared, holding a tray with a wrapped hot sandwich, a fruit cup, and an upgraded snack box with Noah's juice. "Sir." She addressed Mark with professional warmth. "I'm so sorry, but there was a mix-up with the orders. This meal was already processed and paid for, and it'll just go to waste if no one takes it. Would you mind?" Mark blinked, confusion crossing his features. Are you sure? I didn't order." "Completely sure. System error on our end. Please take it. Save me the paperwork of having to throw it out." For a moment, Mark just stared at the tray, and Finley could see the war playing out across his face, pride versus hunger, suspicion versus gratitude. His eyes flickered to Finley, questioning, but she kept her gaze locked on her phone, her expression carefully neutral. Thank you," Mark said finally, accepting the tray. His voice carried a note of disbelief, as if small kindnesses were things that happened to other people, not to him. The attendant smiled and moved on. Mark sat motionless for a moment, looking at the sandwich like it was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Then slowly, he unwrapped it and took a bite. Finley risked a glance from the corner of her eye. The relief on his face, the simple uncomplicated pleasure of warm food after going without, did something strange to her heart. Made it beat differently. Faster. With a rhythm she didn't recognize. "Must be your lucky day," she said coolly, still not looking up from her phone. There was a pause. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, "Thank you." The words were barely a whisper, but they hit her like a shout. He knew. Of course he knew. Maybe he'd seen the exchange with the attendant, or maybe he just understood the way people like her operated. Either way, he knew. And he wasn't angry about the deception. Wasn't offended by the charity. Just grateful. Finley's fingers tightened around her phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Sure," Mark said softly, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Lucky day." Something warm flickered behind her ribcage, something she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten its name. Connection. The kind that came from giving without expecting return. From seeing someone's need and meeting it, not for recognition or tax breaks or photo opportunities, but simply because you could. Beside them, Noah stirred, his eyes blinking open slowly. He sat up, noticed the snack box, and his entire face transformed into pure delight. Dad. Look. They have the cookies. He grabbed the small package, then immediately turned to Mark, his expression earnest. Here, Daddy. You can have half. We share, remember. The boy broke the cookie carefully down the middle, the pieces uneven but given with absolute sincerity. Mark accepted his half with a tenderness that made Finley's throat tight. Thanks, buddy, Mark said, and the love in his voice was so naked, so unguarded, that Finley had to look away. But not before she saw it, the way Noah leaned against his father's arm, the way Mark's hand came up to ruffle his son's hair, the wordless language of love and trust that passed between them. Not perfect. Not polished. Not performed for an audience. Just real. And Finley felt an ache bloom in her chest, one she recognized from childhood, from the time she'd watched other families at restaurants and parks, wondering what it felt like to be held like that, to be loved with such uncomplicated certainty. She'd built an empire. Commanded respect from thousands. Had more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. But she'd never had this. And watching it unfold in the cramped space of seat 14A, she realized with devastating clarity that all her success couldn't fill the hollow space where this kind of love should have been. Mark caught her watching. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw understanding there, the kind that came from seeing straight through someone's armor to the lonely person beneath. Finley looked away first, her fingers finding her phone again, seeking refuge in the familiar glow of her screen. But the warmth behind her ribcage remained. And she didn't know what to do with it. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, smooth and rehearsed. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. Finley felt the shift in the aircraft, the subtle change in engine pitch, the gentle descent that made her ears pop. She'd experienced this hundreds of times, this routine return to Earth. But today, for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, it felt different. It felt like an ending. Noah's face was pressed against the window again, his breath fogging the plastic in small circles. Dad, look. I can see buildings. And cars. They're so tiny. Mark leaned over, his hand covering his son's smaller one against the armrest. That's New York, buddy. That's where we're going. Will we come back up here? In the sky. Someday, Mark promised, and squeezed Noah's hand gently. Finley watched them, father and son, silhouetted against the bright window, hands connected. Something about the image carved itself into her memory with unusual clarity. The tenderness of it. The simple, unshakable trust of a child who knew his father would always hold on. She wanted to freeze this moment. To bottle it somehow, keep it somewhere she could return to when her penthouse felt too empty and her achievements felt too hollow. But time moved forward regardless, and the ground rose steadily to meet them. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a gentle thump, and the plane shuddered slightly as it decelerated. Around them, passengers began the familiar ritual, phones emerging from airplane mode, seatbelts clicking open, the shuffle and rustle of people gathering their belongings. But Finley sat motionless, struck by a feeling she couldn't name. Sadness? Loss? She'd spent 3 hours with these strangers, and now they would disappear into the sprawling chaos of New York City, and she would return to her regularly scheduled life of conference calls and quarterly reports. For the first time in years, maybe ever, she didn't want to rush to her next meeting. Didn't want to climb into the black car that would be waiting, didn't want to review the briefing documents her assistant had prepared, didn't want to slip back into the armor of Finley Howard, CEO. She wanted to stay here, in seat 14B, where she was just Finley. Where someone had charged her phone without asking for recognition. Where a little boy had shared his cookie. Where a man spoke about love and loss without pretense. You okay? Mark's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find him watching her with that same gentle concern he'd shown all morning. Yes, she said automatically. Then more honestly, no. I don't know. He nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Big city. Lots of pressure, I imagine. Something like that. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign blinked off. The cabin erupted into motion, passengers standing, overhead bins opening, the controlled chaos of deplaning. But their row remained still for just a moment longer. "Thank you," Finley said suddenly. "For this morning. For being kind." Mark's smile was warm. "Thank you for the sandwich that magically appeared. And for letting me be your pillow." His eyes crinkled with gentle humor. "You needed the rest." "I did," she admitted. They gathered their things slowly, moving with the tide of passengers toward the exit. Noah chattered excitedly about everything he'd seen, his toy airplane clutched in one hand, Mark's hand firmly in the other. Finley followed a step behind, her designer carry-on feeling heavier than usual. Baggage claim was the usual circus, crowds circling the carousel, the metallic clang of luggage dropping onto the belt, the cacophony of reunions and phone calls and weary travelers. Finley spotted her sleek black suitcase almost immediately and pulled it from the belt with practiced efficiency. Mark and Noah waited for theirs, a worn duffel bag and a small backpack that had seen better days. When they finally retrieved their belongings, Finley found herself frozen, unable to walk away. This was it. This was where they parted. Where she returned to her world and they continued in theirs. Where this strange, unexpected morning became just a story she might tell, or more likely, a memory she'd keep private, something too fragile to share. "Well," Mark said, adjusting the duffel on his shoulder. "I guess this is. Can I have your number?" The words tumbled out before Finley could stop them, before her rational mind could intervene with all the reasons why this was inappropriate, unprofessional, uncharacteristic. Mark blinked, surprise flickering across his face. Finley scrambled for words, feeling her cheeks warm. "I'd like to. I want to know how your interview goes. If that's okay." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Thought he'd see through her fumbling request to the desperate loneliness beneath it. But instead, Mark smiled, that same genuine warmth that had disarmed her from the beginning. "You don't have to," he started. "I want to," Finley insisted, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. Mark pulled out his boarding pass and a pen, scribbling a number on the back. His handwriting was neat, deliberate. He handed it to her, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "That's my cell," he said. "Though I should warn you, I'm not great about checking messages. Usually got my hands full with this guy." He ruffled Noah's hair affectionately. "I'll keep that in mind." Finley tucked the boarding pass carefully into her wallet, treating it with more care than she'd treat most contracts. They stood there for another moment, the crowd flowing around them like water around stones. Finley knew she should leave. Her driver was waiting. Her assistant had probably already sent 3 follow-up messages. The world she'd built was calling her back. But her feet wouldn't move. "Good luck," she said finally. "With the interview. With everything." "Thank you, Finley." The way he said her name, not Ms. Howard, not ma'am, just Finley, made something in her chest constrict. For everything. Noah, who'd been watching this exchange with curious eyes, suddenly stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around Finley's legs in an impromptu hug. She froze, completely unprepared for the contact, for the uninhibited affection of a child who hadn't yet learned that the world was supposed to be kept at arm's length. "Bye, Miss Finley," Noah said, looking up at her with those impossibly warm eyes. "Thanks for being Daddy's friend." Friend. The word landed softly but stayed, echoing in the hollow spaces she'd spent years trying to fill with achievements and acquisitions. When was the last time someone had called her a friend? Not a colleague, not a connection, not a useful contact. A friend. "Bye, Noah," Finley managed, her voice slightly unsteady. "Take care of your dad." "I will." Noah released her and grabbed Mark's hand again. Mark gave her one last smile, understanding, gentle, somehow sad, and then turned toward the exit. Finley watched them go, father and son, hands clasped, Noah's excited chatter fading into the ambient noise of the terminal. She stood there long after they disappeared into the crowd, surrounded by strangers rushing toward their destinations, clutching a boarding pass with a phone number written on it. Her phone buzzed. Her assistant, "Car is waiting. Running 10 minutes behind schedule." Mr. Chen's team pushed the meeting to 2 p.m. Finley stared at the message, then at the boarding pass in her hand. At the number that connected her to a man who worked 2 jobs and raised his son alone and spoke about promises to a wife who died too young. A man who'd shown her more genuine humanity in 3 hours than she'd experienced in 3 years. Friend. The word wouldn't leave her alone. She tucked the boarding pass safely away, pulled up the handle of her suitcase, and walked toward the exit where her black car waited, same as always, same as every other trip. But something had shifted. Some small crack had formed in the walls she'd built so carefully. And as she slid into the back seat of the car, alone with the leather and the silence and the familiar ache of her perfectly constructed life, Finley Howard realized she didn't want to go back to who she'd been before she fell asleep on a stranger's shoulder. She just didn't know yet how to become anyone else. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the chaos of New York traffic. And Finley watched the airport disappear behind her, wondering if she'd just experienced the most important flight of her life, or simply delayed the inevitable return to the cold perfection she'd always known. The corner office on the 42nd floor of the Lumiere Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. On clear days, Finley could see all the way to the harbor. It was the kind of office that appeared in Forbes photo shoots, that made competitors envious, that symbolized everything she'd worked for. Today, she couldn't focus on any of it. Ms. Howard. Her assistant, Jennifer, stood in the doorway with a tablet and an expression of barely concealed concern. The design team is waiting in conference room A. They've been there for 10 minutes. Finley blinked, pulled from thoughts that had nothing to do with fashion or quarterly projections. Right. Yes. Tell them I'll be there in 5. Jennifer hesitated. Are you feeling all right? You seem. I'm fine. The words came out sharper than intended. Finley softened her tone. Just tired from the flight. I'll be there shortly. But she wasn't fine. And it had nothing to do with being tired. 3 days had passed since she'd landed in New York, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd left something crucial behind at JFK. Something more important than the meeting she'd rushed to, more valuable than the contract she'd reviewed, more real than any of the interactions she'd had since. She'd tried to return to normal. Tried to slip back into the rhythm of conference calls and strategic planning sessions and the 1,000 small decisions that comprised her days. But everything felt muted now, like she was watching her own life through frosted glass. Her team had noticed. During yesterday's executive meeting, her CFO had asked her opinion on the Milan expansion 3 times before she'd registered the question. Her creative director had presented the spring line concepts, and Finley had approved them with barely a glance, something the old Finley would never have done. Is everything okay, boss? Marcus, her COO, had asked afterward, his voice low with genuine concern. You're not yourself. She brushed him off with excuses about jet lag and a demanding schedule. But the truth was more complicated, more uncomfortable. The truth was that she couldn't stop thinking about a man in a plain white t-shirt and his son with a toy airplane. Couldn't stop hearing Mark's voice talking about promises and hope. Couldn't stop feeling Noah's arms around her legs. Couldn't stop hearing that one word, friend. She'd typed Mark Steven into Google at least a dozen times, feeling ridiculous and desperate and unlike herself. But the name was too common, and she didn't have enough information. No middle name, no specific city, no company name. The search had yielded thousands of results, none of them helpful. She'd stared at the boarding pass with his phone number, her finger hovering over her phone screen, composing and deleting messages she never sent. How did the interview go? Delete. Just wanted to check in. Delete. I can't stop thinking about you. Delete, delete, delete. What was wrong with her? She was Finley Howard. She didn't pine over strangers. She didn't let 3 hours on a plane dismantle years of carefully constructed emotional discipline. She didn't sit in her office staring at nothing when she should be revolutionizing an industry. And yet, the email arrived on Thursday afternoon, sandwiched between a supplier contract and a media request. Subject line, thank you for flying with us, exclusive loyalty program invitation. Finley almost deleted it automatically. She received dozens of these promotional emails weekly. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the airline's logo, or the subconscious association with that morning. She opened it. The email was standard corporate communication, thanking her for her continued loyalty, inviting her to upgrade her status, offering bonus miles. But at the bottom, she saw the signature. Asterisk best regards. Patricia Chen. Senior Flight Attendant. Customer Relations Specialist asterisk. Patricia Chen. The name sparked immediate recognition. The flight attendant who delivered the mistaken sandwich to Mark. who'd smiled knowingly when Finley had orchestrated that small deception. Finley's heart rate quickened. She clicked on the signature, and Patricia's email address appeared, a direct contact, not just a generic customer service line. For several minutes, Finley stared at her screen, warring with herself. This was inappropriate. Potentially invasive. Definitely outside the bounds of normal professional behavior. But when had normal ever gotten her anything that mattered? She began typing before she could talk herself out of it. Dear Ms. Chun, I hope this email finds you well. You may not remember me, but I was a passenger on Flight 1847 from Los Angeles to New York this past Monday. I sat in seat 14B. I'm reaching out regarding another passenger from that flight, the gentleman in 14A, traveling with his young son. I realize this is an unusual request, but I'm trying to reach him and seem to have lost his contact information. Would you be able to help me reconnect with him, or at least confirm he received his luggage safely? I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. Asterisk best regards. Finley Howard asterisk. She read it 3 times, cringing at how transparent it sounded, how desperate. But she hit send anyway. The response came faster than she'd expected, less than 2 hours later. Dear Ms. Howard. Of course I remember you. And I remember Mr. Stephen and his son Noah, lovely people. I'm limited in what information I can share due to privacy policies, but I can tell you this. I happened to see Mr. Stephen at the airport 2 days ago when I was catching a flight home. He recognized me and we chatted briefly. He mentioned that his job interview didn't go as he'd hoped. They offered the position to an internal candidate. He seemed disappointed but was trying to stay positive for his son's sake. He also mentioned that he was heading back to Los Angeles that evening. I don't have his contact information to share, but I hope this helps. Asterisk take care. Patricia asterisk. Finley read the email once. Twice. 3 times. The interview didn't go as he'd hoped. Mark hadn't gotten the job. The opportunity that was supposed to change everything, the stable position with benefits and normal hours, the chance to be present for Noah gone. He'd flown across the country, spent money he probably couldn't afford to spend, carried hope in his chest like precious cargo. And now he was back in Los Angeles, probably working overnight security and day shift repairs, probably exhausted and discouraged, probably telling Noah that everything would be okay even while wondering how he'd make it work. Finley stood abruptly, her chair rolling backward. She walked to the windows and pressed her palm against the cool glass, looking down at the city 42 floors below. Tiny cars. Tiny people. All of them living lives she'd never bothered to consider, struggling, hoping, fighting for stability she took for granted. She thought about Mark's calloused hands. About the way he'd hesitated before ordering just a juice box. About how he'd saved for months to buy plane tickets so his son could experience flying. About promises made to a dying wife. She thought about Noah breaking his cookie in half, offering it with the unself-conscious generosity of a child who'd been taught that sharing mattered more than having. And she thought about herself, about the woman who'd boarded that plane, armored and alone, who'd viewed kindness as a transaction and connection as a weakness. Something had cracked open during those 3 hours. Something she couldn't close again, even if she wanted to. Jennifer appeared in the doorway again. Ms. Howard? The design team. Cancel it, Finley said without turning around. I'm sorry. Cancel the meeting. Reschedule for tomorrow. Finley turned to face her assistant, and something in her expression made Jennifer's eyes widen slightly. And I need you to do something for me. It's going to sound strange, but I need you to trust me. Of course. What do you need? Finley walked to her desk, pulled out the boarding pass from her wallet, and stared at Mark's phone number for a long moment. Then she made a decision that the old Finley Howard would never have made. The kind of decision that had nothing to do with profit margins or strategic advantage, and everything to do with the uncomfortable, unfamiliar feeling that had taken root in her chest. The feeling that maybe power meant nothing if it couldn't help the people who'd shown you what humanity looked like. I need you to get me on the next flight to Los Angeles, Finley said. And then I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the week. Jennifer blinked. Clear your. Ms. Howard, you have the board meeting on Friday, and the investor presentation. Move them. All of them. May I ask why? Finley looked at the boarding pass again, at the numbers written in Mark's careful handwriting, at the evidence of a 3-hour connection that had somehow mattered more than 3 years of professional success. Because I made a friend, she said quietly. And friends show up when it matters. She didn't know what she was going to do when she got to Los Angeles. Didn't have a plan, didn't have Mark's address, had nothing but a phone number and a conviction that had settled into her bones during 3 days of restless distraction. But for the first time since she'd built her empire, Finley Howard was choosing connection over control. And somehow, that felt like the most important business decision she'd ever made. The coffee shop was in a quiet neighborhood in Culver City, the kind of place that served overpriced lattes to freelancers working on screenplays. Finley had chosen it carefully, neutral territory, casual enough not to intimidate, public enough to feel safe. She'd called Mark's number 3 times before he'd answered. The first 2 attempts had gone to voicemail, and she'd hung up without leaving a message, her courage faltering. The 3rd time, he'd picked up on the 2nd ring, his voice cautious. "Hello. Mark? It's Finley. Finley Howard. From the flight." A pause. Then warmer, "Finley. I didn't expect to hear from you. I know this is unexpected, but I'm in Los Angeles, and I was hoping we could meet. Just for coffee. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Another pause, longer this time. She'd heard the question in his silence, why? But he hadn't asked it aloud. "Okay," he'd said finally. "When?" Now she sat in a corner booth, her 3rd espresso cooling in front of her, watching the door with an anxiety she hadn't felt since her first board presentation. She'd dressed down, jeans, a simple cashmere sweater, minimal jewelry. Trying to look approachable. Trying to look like someone who wasn't about to make a business proposition that had kept her up for 2 nights straight. The door chimed, and Mark entered, scanning the room until his eyes found hers. He looked exactly as she remembered, jeans, plain shirt, that quiet strength in the way he carried himself. But there was something else in his expression now. Caution. Curiosity. Maybe a touch of weariness. He slid into the booth across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. "Hi," Finley said, and winced internally at how inadequate the greeting sounded. "Hi." Mark's smile was gentle but reserved. "You came all the way to Los Angeles?" "I was already planning a trip," she lied, then immediately regretted it. "No. This required honesty. Actually, that's not true. I came because I wanted to see you." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Finley took a breath. She'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times on the flight, had the words perfectly arranged in her mind. But now, sitting across from him, everything felt wrong. Too calculated. Too corporate. Too much like the person she was trying not to be. "I heard about the job," she said finally. "The interview. I'm sorry it didn't work out." Mark's expression shifted, surprise, then something that might have been embarrassment. "How did you?" He stopped, understanding dawning. "The flight attendant. Patricia." "Yes. She mentioned she'd seen you." Finley wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, needing something to hold. "I know you came here for that opportunity. That it mattered to you and Noah." It did. Mark's voice was quiet. "But things don't always work out the way we plan. That's life. It doesn't have to be." The words hung between them. Mark tilted his head slightly, studying her with those perceptive eyes that had seen through her from the beginning. "What do you mean?" This was it. The moment she'd flown across the country for. Finley straightened, feeling her professional persona click into place. The confident CEO who'd negotiated $100 million deals, who'd convinced skeptical investors to take chances on her vision. "I have a proposition for you," she began. "Lumiere, my company, we're expanding our urban development initiatives. Sustainable manufacturing facilities, ethical supply chains, community partnerships. We need someone to manage the logistics for our West Coast operations. Someone with construction experience, project management skills, someone who understands the ground-level work." Mark listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "The position is based here in Los Angeles," Finley continued, gaining momentum. "Salary is $120,000 annually, full benefits, health insurance that covers dependents, retirement matching. Normal hours, no overnight shifts, no weekends unless absolutely necessary. It would give you stability. Time with Noah. The kind of life you were looking for when you flew to New York." She pulled out a folder she'd prepared, a formal job description, benefit details, everything laid out in crisp, professional documents. She slid it across the table. I think you'd be perfect for this role. Your experience, your work ethic, your integrity. She stopped herself, realizing how much like a pitch this sounded. Mark, I want to offer you this job. For a long moment, Mark didn't move. He looked at the folder, then at her, then back at the folder. Slowly, he opened it, scanning the documents with careful attention. Finley watched his face, trying to read his reaction, but he'd gone still in a way that made her suddenly nervous. Finally, he closed the folder and pushed it gently back across the table. No, he said quietly. The word hit her like a physical blow. What? I can't accept this. Mark's voice was calm, kind even, but absolutely certain. I don't understand. Finley felt her carefully constructed plan crumbling. This is everything you needed. The salary alone would change your life. It's too much, Mark interrupted gently. And you know it is. What do you mean? Mark leaned forward, his eyes holding hers with uncomfortable directness. Finley, I barely know you. We sat together on a plane for 3 hours. That doesn't qualify me for a 6-figure management position at a global company. He paused, his voice softening. This isn't about qualifications. This is about guilt. The word struck something true and painful inside her chest. That's not. Isn't it? Mark's tone wasn't accusatory, just honest. You're trying to fix something. Trying to make up for. I don't know what. But you can't buy your way out of whatever you're feeling. Finley felt her defenses rising, her professional armor clicking back into place. This is a legitimate business opportunity. I wouldn't offer it if I didn't think you were capable. Maybe I am capable, Mark said. But that's not why you're offering it. He tapped the folder gently. This is charity dressed up as opportunity. And I don't need saving, Finley. Neither does Noah. The gentleness in his rejection made it worse somehow. If he'd been angry, if he'd accused her of condescension or pity, she could have fought back. But this quiet refusal, delivered with the same compassion he'd shown when she'd woken up on his shoulder, left her defenseless. I just wanted to help, she said, and heard how small her voice sounded. I know. Mark's expression was understanding, almost sad. But you don't owe me anything. Miss Howard. I charged your phone because it was the kind thing to do. You bought me a sandwich for the same reason. Those were gifts, freely given. They don't create debt. Then let me do this as a gift, Finley tried, hearing the desperation in her own voice. Mark shook his head slowly. You can't buy kindness. You can only live it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What you're offering me, it's generous. It's thoughtful. But it's not what either of us needs. Then what do I need? The question escaped before she could stop it, raw and vulnerable in a way that horrified her. Mark looked at her for a long moment, and she saw recognition in his eyes, the same look he'd given her on the plane when he'd seen past her armor to something true underneath. I think you need to figure out why meeting a stranger on a plane affected you so much, he said quietly. Why you flew across the country to offer a job to someone you barely know. Why you can't seem to let this go. He leaned back, his expression gentle. You don't need to rescue me, Finley. You need to rescue yourself. The truth of it cut through every defense she'd ever built. For the first time in her life, someone was looking at her and seeing not her power, not her money, not her success or her influence. Just a person. A lonely, lost person who'd mistaken connection for a business transaction. Tears pricked at her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. I don't know how, she whispered. I know, Mark said, and his kindness made it harder to hold back the tears. But buying your way to redemption isn't the answer. Neither is trying to fix my life to avoid dealing with your own. They sat in silence, the coffee shop noise flowing around them, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of conversations, the clink of cups. Finley felt hollowed out, exposed in a way she'd never allowed herself to be. I should go, Mark said finally, sliding out of the booth. Noah's with a neighbor, and I don't like to leave him too long. Finley nodded, unable to form words. Mark paused, then reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. The gesture was warm, human, free of judgment. "Thank you," he said, "for caring enough to try. That means something, even if I can't accept what you're offering." He released her hand. "Take care of yourself, Finley. Really take care. Not the kind that money can buy." And then he was gone, the door chiming behind him, leaving Finley alone with a folder full of opportunities he didn't want and a heart that felt both emptier and somehow freer than it had in years. She'd come to Los Angeles to fix Mark's life. Instead, he'd held up a mirror and shown her the fractures in her own. And for the first time, she couldn't look away. 3 weeks had passed since the coffee shop. 3 weeks of Mark pushing through double shifts and Noah's endless questions about when they'd fly again. 3 weeks of telling himself that turning down Finley's offer had been the right thing to do, even when the rent was due and the car needed repairs and the exhaustion settled so deep in his bones he sometimes forgot what it felt like to be rested. But he'd made his choice. And he'd made it for the right reasons. It was a Tuesday evening when he trudged up the stairs to their second-floor apartment, Noah's hand warm in his. His son had spent the day at the neighbor's, Mrs. Chun, who watched him for a fraction of what daycare would cost, and was chattering about the caterpillar they'd found in her garden. "And Mrs. Chun said it's gonna turn into a butterfly, Dad. A real one. Can we get a jar and keep it? Can we watch it change?" "Maybe, Bud," Mark said, fumbling with his keys. "We'll see." The mailbox in the lobby had been stuffed full, mostly junk mail and overdue notices he'd deal with later. But as he sorted through the envelopes while Noah ran ahead to their door, one caught his attention. Thick, cream-colored, expensive paper. His name and address written in elegant script that looked hand-done, not printed. No return address. Mark's heart did something strange in his chest. He knew that handwriting, though he'd only seen it once, on the back of a job offer he'd refused. "Dad, come on. I'm hungry." Noah called from down the hallway. "1 second, buddy." Mark unlocked their apartment and let Noah rush inside, heading straight for the kitchen and the promise of snacks. But Mark stayed in the doorway, turning the envelope over in his hands, almost afraid to open it. Finally, he slid his finger under the seal. Inside was a letter, handwritten on the same expensive paper, and another document with an official seal. Mark pulled out the second document first. Scholarship certificate. This certifies that Noah Stephen has been awarded a full academic scholarship to Bright Horizons Elementary Academy for the duration of his primary education. This scholarship covers all tuition, fees, materials, and enrichment programs. Funded by the Elena Stephen Memorial Education Fund. Mark's hands began to shake. He read it again. And again. His wife's name. Noah's full ride to one of the best elementary schools in Los Angeles. The kind of school Mark had looked at websites for but never dared to dream they could afford. He set the certificate down carefully, as if it might disappear, and unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. "Dear Mark, I know you told me you don't need saving. And you're right, you don't. But Noah deserves every opportunity to chase his dreams, whether that's becoming a pilot or anything else his beautiful, curious mind imagines. This isn't charity. This isn't me trying to buy my way into redemption or ease my guilt. This is simply me using resources I have to honor something that matters, a child's future and a father's love. I named the fund after Elena because I think she'd want this for Noah. From everything you told me about her, she believed in kindness, in hope, in the power of education to transform lives. This is me trying to live those values, not just talk about them. You reminded me what it means to be human. You showed me that power without compassion is emptiness, that success without connection is just expensive loneliness. I can't repay that gift, but I can pay it forward. For Noah's dreams. For Elena's memory. For the man who charged a stranger's phone and called it simple kindness. This isn't about owing or being owed. This is about believing in good people. Thank you for being one of them. F. Mark read the letter 3 times, and by the 3rd time, tears were streaming down his face, dripping onto the expensive paper and making the ink blur slightly. "Dad." He looked up to find Noah standing in the kitchen doorway, a half-eaten apple in his hand, concern written across his small face. "Dad, why are you crying? Are you sad?" Mark set the letter down and opened his arms. Noah ran to him, and Mark pulled his son close, holding him with the fierce gratitude of a father who'd been given an impossible gift. "Nobody," he whispered into Noah's hair. "I'm not sad. I'm the opposite of sad." Then why are you crying? Mark pulled back slightly, looking into his son's eyes, Elena's eyes, full of innocence and trust and the belief that the world was fundamentally good. Because sometimes, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion, someone out there reminds you that there are still good people in the world. People who do kind things just because they can. Just because they care. Like the lady on the plane? Noah asked. Miss Finley. Mark nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Yeah, buddy. Like Miss Finley. Noah hugged him tighter. I liked her. She had sad eyes but a nice smile. She did, Mark agreed. She really did. 42 floors above Manhattan, Finley Howard stood at her office windows, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as dusk settled over New York. The skyline was breathtaking, as always, a testament to human ambition and achievement, to the kind of success she'd spent her life chasing. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about success. She was thinking about a letter she'd written by hand, revising it 7 times until the words felt true. About a scholarship fund she'd established in a dead woman's name, honoring a person she'd never met but felt she'd come to know through her husband's stories and son's eyes. About doing something that would never appear in Forbes, never impress her board, never add to her net worth. Something that was simply, quietly good. Her phone sat dark on her desk. She'd resisted the urge to track the delivery, to confirm it had arrived, to reach out for validation or acknowledgement. This gift wasn't transactional. It wasn't about recognition or gratitude or building a relationship. It was about a little boy who deserved to chase his dreams without his father sacrificing everything. About a man who'd shown her kindness when she'd been too proud to recognize she needed it. About keeping a promise to herself that she'd made in a coffee shop 3 weeks ago, to stop trying to buy her way to redemption and start actually living differently. The city lights blurred slightly, and Finley realized she was crying. Not the desperate, confused tears from the plane or the frustrated tears from the coffee shop. These were different. Cleaner, somehow. She'd spent years believing that success meant reaching the top, that power meant never needing anyone, that wealth could insulate her from the messy, vulnerable business of being human. But standing here now, having given away something that cost her nothing financially but meant everything emotionally, Finley felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Peace. Not pride in her accomplishments. Not satisfaction with a deal well made. Not the hollow validation of another industry award or glowing profile. Just peace. Simple, quiet, profound. The kind that came from knowing she'd done something good for no other reason than it was good to do. The kind that came from honoring the lesson a stranger had taught her at 30,000 feet, that the best parts of being human had nothing to do with power or prestige. They had to do with connection. With kindness. With showing up for people even when, especially when, there was nothing to gain. Her assistant's voice crackled over the intercom. Ms. Howard? The car is ready to take you home. Home. Her penthouse apartment with its designer furniture and temperature-controlled wine cellar and panoramic views. The place where she lived alone, ate takeout at her desk, and fell asleep with her laptop open more often than not. Thank you, Jennifer, Finley said. I'll be down in a minute. She gathered her things slowly, letting the peace settle deeper into her bones. Tomorrow she had meetings, negotiations, the endless demands of running an empire. Tomorrow she'd return to being the ice queen of fashion, the woman who'd built something extraordinary through sheer force of will. But tonight, just for tonight, she was simply Finley. The woman who'd fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder and woken up to find that kindness still existed in the world. The woman who'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was give without expecting anything in return. The woman who discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or deals, but in the quiet knowledge that somewhere in Los Angeles, a little boy who dreamed of flying would get the chance to soar. And that was worth more than any balance sheet could ever show. Finley took one last look at the city lights, then turned toward the door. For the first time in years, she was going home at a reasonable hour. And for the first time in longer than that, she wasn't going home alone, because she carried with her the memory of 2 people who'd reminded her what it meant to be human. That, she realized, was the kind of company that actually mattered. The grand ballroom of the Westin LAX was filled with 1,500 people, CEOs, entrepreneurs, industry leaders who'd paid premium prices to attend the Global Leadership Summit. Crystal chandeliers cast elegant light over tables draped in white linen, and the stage was set with a kind of professional production value that money could buy. Finley Howard stood in the wings, watching the conference organizer finish her introduction. 6 months ago, she would have been reviewing talking points, checking her appearance one last time, mentally rehearsing the polished presentation she'd prepared. 6 months ago, she would have been ready to deliver the keynote everyone expected, data-driven insights about disrupting industries, strategies for scaling businesses, the familiar blueprint of how she'd built her empire. But 6 months had changed her. The woman being introduced, the visionary CEO who transformed Lumiere from near bankruptcy to a billion-dollar powerhouse, felt like a stranger now. Or perhaps more accurately, like a former version of herself she'd finally outgrown. Please welcome to the stage, Finley Howard. The applause was thunderous as Finley walked into the lights, her heels clicking against the polished stage. She looked out at the sea of faces, successful, ambitious, hungry for the secrets of power and profit. Once, she would have seen kindred spirits. Now she saw what she used to be, people chasing something that would never satisfy the hunger they couldn't name. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady as the applause faded. "It's an honor to be here." She paused, looking down at the podium where her prepared speech waited on the teleprompter. 45 minutes of content about market disruption, leadership principles, strategic vision. All of it true. None of it honest. Finley stepped away from the podium. "I'm not going to give you the speech I prepared," she said, and felt a ripple of surprise move through the audience. "Instead, I want to tell you a story. About a flight I took 6 months ago that changed everything I thought I knew about success." In the third row from the back, partially hidden behind a pillar, Mark Stevens sat with his son. Noah was fidgeting slightly in his new school uniform, navy blazer, crisp white shirt, a tie he'd learned to knot himself last month. The scholarship had come with a formal dress code. And Noah had approached it with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything, complete, uninhibited joy. "Is that her?" Noah whispered, leaning forward. "Is that Miss Finley?" Mark nodded, his throat suddenly tight. He'd seen the conference advertised 2 weeks ago and, on impulse he still didn't fully understand, had registered. The ticket had been expensive, money he would have hesitated to spend before the scholarship freed up their budget. But something had compelled him to come, to see what had become of the woman who'd offered him a job he couldn't accept and then given his son a future he couldn't have imagined. "It's her," Mark confirmed, and Noah's face split into a grin. "I boarded that plane exhausted," Finley continued, her voice carrying easily through the silent ballroom. "Not just physically tired, but spiritually empty. I'd spent 15 years building an empire, and somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that success meant never needing anyone. That power meant isolation. That wealth could fill the spaces where connection should have been." She paused, meeting eyes around the room. "I was wrong." A woman in the front row leaned forward, completely focused. Others had pulled out phones to record this unexpected deviation from the expected corporate keynote. "On that flight, I fell asleep on a stranger's shoulder. When I woke up, embarrassed and disoriented, I discovered he'd charged my dying phone while I slept. A small gesture. The kind most people wouldn't even notice." Finley's voice softened. "But it broke something open inside me. Because in my world, in our world, people don't give without expecting something in return." Heads nodded throughout the audience. They understood this calculus, this transactional approach to human interaction. "This man was a single father," Finley continued, "working 2 jobs to support his son. He'd flown across the country for a job interview that didn't work out. He had every reason to be bitter, cynical, focused solely on his own survival." She paused. "But instead, he showed me kindness. Not because he wanted something from me. Not because it would benefit him. Simply because it was the right thing to do." Mark felt Noah's hand slip into his, squeezing tight. His son looked up at him with those perceptive eyes, Elena's eyes, and whispered, "She's talking about you, Dad." "I know, buddy," Mark whispered back, blinking against the unexpected sting of tears. "I tried to repay that kindness," Finley said. "I tracked him down. Offered him a job with a generous salary, thinking I could fix his life the way I fixed failing businesses, with money and power and strategic intervention." She smiled sadly. "He refused. And when I asked him why, he said something I've thought about every single day since: you can't buy kindness. You can only live it." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 1,500 successful people, all of them accustomed to buying their way to solutions, absorbing this simple truth. He was right, Finley said. I'd spent my entire life believing that wealth was the answer. That if I accumulated enough success, enough power, enough influence, I'd finally feel whole. But all I felt was empty. Because I'd forgotten, or maybe never learned, that true wealth isn't measured in numbers. It's measured in grace. In the moments we choose kindness when no one's watching. In showing up for people not because it advances our interests, but because it's simply the right thing to do. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of confession. That stranger on the plane reminded me what it means to be human. He showed me that power means nothing if it doesn't serve others. That the most important things we do are often the smallest: charging someone's phone, sharing a meal, listening without agenda. Finley's eyes swept across the audience. 6 months ago, I was the ice queen of fashion. Brilliant, successful, and profoundly lonely. Today, I'm still a CEO. Still running a billion-dollar company. But I'm also trying to be a better human being. To lead with compassion, not just competence. To remember that the people who work for me, who buy from me, who interact with my company, they're not resources to be optimized. They're human beings deserving of dignity and kindness. She paused, vulnerable in a way she'd never been publicly. I'm not perfect at it. I still slip back into old patterns. But I'm trying. Because that man and his son showed me that the legacy that matters isn't the one that appears in Forbes. It's the one we leave in people's hearts. Noah tugged on Mark's sleeve urgently. Dad, we should go say hi. She doesn't know we're here. Mark hesitated, watching Finley on stage, bathed in spotlight, speaking truth to an audience that desperately needed to hear it. I don't know, Bud. This is her moment. But she'd want to see us, Noah insisted with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old. I know she would. So my challenge to you tonight, Finley concluded, is this: what are you building? Are you building empires of isolation, or communities of connection? Are you accumulating wealth that dies with you, or creating legacies of kindness that ripple outward? Are you so busy climbing that you've forgotten why you started climbing in the first place? She stepped back from center stage, her eyes bright with unshed tears. A stranger on a plane changed my life by showing me simple kindness. Imagine what we could do, all of us with all our resources and influence, if we chose to live that way intentionally. If we measured success not by what we accumulated, but by what we gave away. Not by who we conquered, but by who we lifted up. That's the kind of power that actually matters. That's the kind of wealth that actually lasts. The silence held for one beat. 2. Then the ballroom erupted in applause, not the polite golf clap of professional courtesy, but genuine sustained ovation. People stood, their faces reflecting the recognition of truth they'd been avoiding, the hunger for meaning they'd been trying to fill with quarterly reports and market shares. Finley stood in the light, letting the applause wash over her, feeling more exposed and more authentic than she'd ever felt on any stage. Backstage, conference organizers waited to usher her to the VIP reception, but Finley waved them off. Give me a minute, she said. She walked through the side exit into the cool Los Angeles evening, away from the crowd and expectations and the performance of success. The sky was darkening toward night, and somewhere above, planes traced paths across the atmosphere, carrying strangers toward unknown destinations. Her phone buzzed insistently, dozens of messages from colleagues, media requests, board members wanting to discuss her unexpected speech. She silenced it without reading any of them. Instead, she tilted her head back and looked up at the sky. The same sky she'd crossed 6 months ago, when she'd been someone else entirely. When she'd thought she had everything figured out, when she believed that isolation was strength and vulnerability was weakness. Miss Finley. The small voice made her turn. And there, standing in the doorway with his father behind him, was Noah Stephen, older now, taller, wearing a school uniform that represented dreams made possible. His face was split in a grin that rivaled the city lights. Noah, Finley breathed, and before she could think, she was kneeling down, and Noah was running toward her. He crashed into her with the unself-conscious affection of a child, wrapping his arms around her neck. You remembered us. You told our story. Over Noah's shoulder, Finley met Mark's eyes. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, wearing the same gentle smile she remembered from the plane. But there was something else in his expression now: pride, understanding, and a recognition that they'd both changed in the months since that coffee shop conversation. You came, Finley said, her voice thick with emotion. We came, Mark confirmed, walking closer. Couldn't miss the chance to see what became of you. He looked her over, not assessing her designer dress or expensive shoes, but searching her face for something deeper. You kept your promise. What promise? To live it. Not just talk about it. Finley felt tears spill over, and for once she didn't try to hide them. I'm trying. I know. Mark smiled. That's all any of us can do. Noah pulled back, looking up at Finley with those impossibly earnest eyes. I'm in first grade now. At Bright Horizons. We're learning about space, and I'm going to be an astronaut and a pilot and maybe a scientist too. That's wonderful, Noah, Finley said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Dad says you made it possible. The school and everything. He said you were an angel. No, Finley said gently, looking at Mark. Your dad is the angel. I just, finally learned to pay attention. They stood there in the Los Angeles evening, three people connected by a chance encounter that had proven to be anything but chance. Around them, the city hummed with life and ambition and the endless pursuit of more. But in this quiet moment, they'd found something rarer than success, more valuable than wealth. They'd found proof that transformation was possible. That kindness could ripple outward. That sometimes the most important journey happened not across miles, but across the distance between who we are and who we're meant to become. Thank you, Mark said quietly. For everything. No, Finley said, taking Noah's hand and then Mark's, completing the connection. Thank you. For reminding me how to be human. Above them, a plane traced its path across the darkening sky, carrying strangers toward unknown destinations, toward encounters that might change everything. And Finley Howard, standing beneath that sky with her hand in theirs, understood something she'd never learned in any boardroom. Some flights aren't just about getting somewhere. They're about becoming someone new. And that journey? That journey never really ends. It just keeps lifting you higher.